Muy buenas tardes y bienvenidos a
Good
Casa
afternoon.
Árabe.
Welcome
Soy
to
Karim
Casa
Hauser
Árabe. My name
y
is
pues
Karim
me da mucho
Hauser,
gusto
and I'm very happy
estar esta tarde
to
aquí
have
presentando
here
esta
today
mesa redonda
this
explicando que
panel
forma parte
explaining that this
del
is
ciclo,
part of the
bueno, del Festival de Jóvenes
festival that
Creadores
we're holding
Arabismos y
of young
de alguna forma va a
creators,
marcar o nos
Arabisms,
va a poner en
and this is
contexto
going to
a
place
los
us in
jóvenes
a
creadores que a
context
partir de
about
mañana
the
van a
young
estar
creators
exponiendo su
who are going
trabajo.
to be exhibiting their work.
Tenemos una
We have
conferencia ilustrada, tenemos
conferences,
música,
we have
tenemos una
music, we
exposición que
have
también
an
se
exhibition
inaugura
that is
el
also going
sábado,
to be
teatro,
inaugurated on
y bueno, el
Saturday,
programa
and
lo podréis
theater as
encontrar
well.
afuera.
And you can find
Y esta
the
tarde nos
agenda
importaba mucho tener
outside.
aquí
And today we
esta
were
charla sobre
very
la
interested in
generación de los
having
millennials, y qué
this
mejor
debate
que
about the
invitar a Juan
millennials
Cole, que desde
generation,
Estados
and who
Unidos
better
ha
to
seguido
invite than
de
Juan
cerca
Cole, who has
este
followed
fenómeno y
this
tiene un
phenomenon
libro
from the
publicado,
United
y
States. He
para ello
has
también hemos
published a book on
querido
this topic,
involucrar
and we also wanted
a
to
la
have
editorial,
here
a
the
Edicions Bellaterra,
editors,
representada
Ediciones
aquí por
Bellaterra,
Alfonso Carlos Bolado, que va
represented by
a
Alfonso
presentar
Carlos
y moderar el
Bolado, who is
acto, y
going to
también hemos querido,
introduce this
digamos,
event
llamar
today. And we also
esta mesa
wanted
redonda
to invite to
cómo los
this
millennials están
panel
cambiando el Mediterráneo, y no solo el
the
mundo árabe, que
viewpoint
es
on
el
how the
título
millennials are
del
changing the
libro de Juan Cole,
Mediterranean.
y para ello
And
hemos invitado a
we
Nessrin El
have
Hachlaf, que
invited
también nos va a
Nesreen
hablar
El
de la
Hachlaf,
experiencia de los
who is
millennials
going to tell us
en
about
España.
the experience of the
Como
millennials in
solemos hacer,
Spain.
habrá primero las
As we usually
intervenciones
do, we will
de
have
los dos ponentes,
the
de Juan y
both
de Nesrin,
speakers
moderados
taking the floor
por Alfonso
first,
Carlos Bolado, y después
moderated by
pasaremos
Alfonso
a
Carlos
las
Bolado, and then we
preguntas
will have some time
del
for the
público, que esperemos que sean
Q&A
muchas,
that we hope
y bueno, que
will
lo
be
disfrutéis.
plenty.
Gracias.
So I hope you enjoy this evening. Thank you.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. First of all, I wanted to thank you all for being here today. Obviously, I wanted to thank also Casa Árabe and Karim for giving me the opportunity to address you today as the publisher of Juan Cole in Spanish. This is an honor that I hope I am deserving of. I thank Professor Cole and Ms. Nessrin El Hachlaf that they have accepted to be the protagonists here today. Their resumes make them the best and most suited people to talk in this panel about the millennials that I think has been arranged by Casa Árabe in a very intelligent decision. One of the bad decisions of this idea of we have in the West about the Middle East, we think that the religion, dictatorship, and a delay in development are the key factors, and we forget about the complexities of these societies. And in this conference, there is a high percentage of youngsters among the above 400 million Arabs. These are the millennials generation, and their presence is very prominent. They live in their origin countries, in their host countries, and they are subject to several influences and adaptations that derives from this changing world. The merit of Mr. Cole and Ms. El Hachlaf is when they talk about Egypt, Iran, and Iraq, and also about Morocco, in the case of Ms. El Hachlaf, is to bring about all these realities that are opposed to the stereotypes that we are so used to deal with in our day-to-day lives. First of all, we will have Mr. Cole, an expert in the Islam, and he is also a great expert in the societies where he has been able to understand all the key characteristics of this area, and he has several proposals and clarifications for us that are underlined by the fact that he understands reality very well, and also he applies a very good common sense that, as in the Western countries, are lacking right now. In Bellaterra, we have published two of his works. The first one is a new commitment with the Islamic world, and the second one is the new Arabs, which is the base for the dissertation of Mr. Cole. Obviously, in Bellaterra, we are very proud of both publications, and in our very humble way, we think we have added something to its dissemination. And here we have Mr. Cole and Ms. El Hachlaf, and I will leave the floor to them now.
Well, I can't say how pleased I am to be here in Madrid, and I'm so grateful to Casa Arabe and Bellaterra for this kind invitation. I'm especially grateful to my publisher for doing such a wonderful job in translating these books that I've written. Today I want to talk a little bit with hindsight about the region. Karima, is there going to be translation, or there's simultaneous translation? I'm sorry, I didn't see back there. Okay, fine. Start the presentation. The first thing to note is how young the population is in much of the Arab world. There are differences between countries, but as a whole, the mean age, that is the age at which half the population is older than that, half is younger than that, the median age, is remarkably low. In Egypt, it's 23. In Tunisia, is a little older at 31. In Libya, 28. In Syria, only 24. And this is in contradistinction to the age profile in most industrialized Western countries, where you can see in Spain it's 42, in France it's 41, in Greece it's 44. So this creates a completely different dynamic economically, socially, politically. Where in the world would Egypt find jobs for all of those young people who are coming on the job market? If you have a country of 90 million and the median age is 23, imagine how many people are graduating from school and college every year looking for jobs, and Egypt is not able to provide those jobs to them. The youth in this generation, people born in the 1980s, 90s, and early zeros, have flexed their muscles politically already. And in Tunisia, I would argue that they have overthrown the government twice. In Libya, Libya is a very murky political situation, but they did overthrow the dictator, the long-lived dictator Muammar Gaddafi. And in Egypt, again, they overthrew the government twice. In Yemen, again, very, very murky situation, but the dictator for life, Ali Abdullah Saleh, was initially forced to step down in 2012. If we look at them after they have engaged in these revolutions, and they were youth-led revolutions, the people in the streets were obviously young. They did have allies in the older generation, and especially in the working class, but they were predominantly youth revolutions, and remarkable in that way. And if we look at what motivates them, the opinion polling that's been done on Arab youth in recent years, their biggest concern nowadays is terrorism. They're really, really afraid of the so-called Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, and in Sinai and Sirte in Libya. They're as or more afraid of terrorism as a concern than typical Western publics are. But beyond that, their other priority is jobs, is economic. And so those are the two big things on their minds: security and sort of political security and economic security. They wouldn't mind some more personal liberties, and about 21% of them prioritize that, but you can see from this chart that democracy is a little bit down the list of their goals. And this is one reason that I think Western journalists have misinterpreted these movements and have pronounced them failures, because, of course, although they overthrew some dictators, their societies have not typically, in the aftermath, evolved towards parliamentary democracy, although arguably Tunisia has gone in that direction. But I don't think that was the main point of these revolutions. I think the young people I talked to felt that the authoritarian governments that they lived under were by their nature so corrupt that they were ruining the lives of the youth. Why couldn't you get a job? Well, it's because the Mubarak administration in Egypt or the Ben Ali regime in Tunisia were discouraging foreign investment by demanding bribes from companies that wanted to come into the country. And we know this is true from the State Department documents that were leaked by Chelsea Manning to WikiLeaks. There's a story in one of them in 2006, McDonald's came to Tunis, and they looked around that maybe they could invest in Tunisia. And of course, the Ben Ali officials said, well, sure, you can open a McDonald's in Tunis, but we need to bribe first. And so McDonald's decided not to do it. Maybe it was better for the health of the Tunisian public that they made that decision, but in any case, there were also productive companies that might have liked to invest in these countries that were scared away by the high levels of corruption. And then in order to rise high and succeed in a place like Egypt or Ben Ali, the youth had to tie themselves to those regimes if they could, and many of them were not able to or didn't want to. So they felt as though they were being blocked from employment, from a participation in their society, and of course politically by these regimes, which practiced very brutal techniques of controlling the public. Any young man in Tunis or Cairo was constantly being bothered by the police, being manhandled, being searched, and so it set up an adversarial relationship. The revolutions that I studied were not primarily religious in their character. The youth who participated in them were of all kinds. Some of them were pious and personally religious. Others of them were much more secular-minded. But the movement was not formulated as a religious movement. And in fact, in Egypt, for instance, the long-standing religious right movement, the Muslim Brotherhood, its leaders declined to participate in the revolution. And while some young Muslim brothers did sort of defy their leadership and come out with the more secular youth, it was the secular-minded youth that led the revolution. One estimate that I saw of people who were kind of doing informal exit polling from Tahrir Square suggested as that maybe 1/4 of the demonstrators were from the Muslim Brotherhood. So who were the others? Well, a lot of them, in my view, were children of leftist families. In the 60s and 70s, there had been so many intellectuals, middle-class people in Egypt and workers who were enthusiastic about Arab nationalism and were influenced by leftist ideas. The Communist Party in Egypt was always a tiny affair and not very representative, but some of the ideas of the communists inflected or influenced many of the other social currents in the country, and Arab nationalism had a left-of-center tilt. The governments in these countries destroyed any standalone parties, and so in the generation of the millennials, it wasn't an option to join a leftist party for the most part, but without a party, they still organized around their ideas. Many of them were religious, but a recent poll shows that in some countries, Palestine, Morocco, this is true in Lebanon and Tunisia as well, there's a great deal of dissatisfaction among the youth with the mainstream of Islamic practice. They think that it's hidebound and not evolving and so forth. Many of these revolutionary youth had a conflicted attitude towards the United States. They were highly critical of the Bush administration's invasion and occupation of Iraq. And in fact, activism in protest of the Iraq war was one of the places that these youth revolutions began. That was back in 2003 when some of the youth started mobilizing and forming networks. I think they were extremely upset with the Obama administration's conservatism. The United States is a status quo power, not really very enthusiastic about things changing radically around it, and had depended heavily on the dictators like Mubarak and Ben Ali, not so much Gaddafi. And so when the revolution broke out against Mubarak, Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State. She said the Mubaraks are like family friends of the Clintons. The youth really minded that, and when Mrs. Clinton came to Cairo after the revolution, she sought a meeting with the youth leaders, and they refused to see her. But I think they had some hopes for the Obama administration, and after all, Obama did, in the end, swing around and support the removal of Mubarak. However, in the past 6 months or so, they have become extremely alarmed about the United States. So the polling is that they see the Trump administration as an enemy of the Arab world, the number who see the U.S. as a potential friend has fallen dramatically. In the period from 2011 to 2013, the issues that drove these youth included, I would argue, neoliberalism, which is a way of talking about marketizing or privatizing public goods. I think this is a subject of some dispute in Spain as well. But you know, most of the millennials were brought up in more or less socialist governments. One doesn't necessarily think about them that way, but in Egypt, I think still today, 50% or 40% of the economy is in government hands. And there's very large public sectors. And in opinion polling, the Arab public thinks that the government is there to take care of people. So the Washington Consensus that he became influential, especially from the 1990s, centered around taking public services like education, the electricity provision, all kinds of public goods, and taking them out of the government hands and putting them in the hands of private companies. In the Arab world, some privatization occurred, and governments were forced into it by the West, because, for instance, if you wanted a loan from the International Monetary Fund, they would come back to you and say, well, you have this inefficient factory that the government is running, why don't you sell it and let an entrepreneur run it? And the theory that the entrepreneurs would do a better job is not always true. So, and then there's opportunities for insider trading. So the government knows when it's going to sell a factory, and people in the government will call up their friends who have some wealth and say, why don't you buy it? It's a good deal. So many of these privatization ventures created a kind of cronyism, and the government was able to create billionaires that in turn were grateful to it. So one famous example is in 2004, the Egyptian government sold the Egyptian steel mill, and it sold it to the only other competitor of the government steel mill, a private entrepreneur, Ahmed Ez, who was very close to the Mubaraks. And at least the allegation is that Ez then ran the government steel mill into the ground so as to build up his original private holdings, and steel became expensive. And this is the opposite of the way that the neoliberal theorists imagined that the process should work. And the youth saw this happen, and they blogged about it, and they were very critical of this notion that the market should run everything, because they viewed the market as irrational and as open to corruption. It became one more area where corruption operated and blighted their lives. Then one of their big complaints, and I think this is not underlined enough by observers of these revolutions, one of their big complaints was what my own professor Saad ad-Din Ibrahim called jumlukia in Arabic. He took the words for republic, al-jumhuriya, and monarchy, al-mamlakiya, and he put them together. He said jumlukia. And what he means by that is that these are republics, and in republics, the ruler is not supposed to be a dynasty. The son doesn't inherit from the father the throne. But there was a tendency in Arab Republican regimes with presidents for life, starting in 2000, to hope to hand over power to a family member. So Hafez al-Assad succeeded in putting Bashar al-Assad in power in Syria, arguably a huge disaster. And these youth were determined that this would not be allowed to happen in other countries. And you can say that the Arab Spring failed in many of its objectives, but the one thing the youth did manage to accomplish was that they stopped the tendency towards republican monarchy. So Gaddafi's son Saif was going to take over Libya after him. Mubarak's son Gamal was going to take over Egypt. Ali Abdullah Saleh's son Mohammed was going to take over Yemen, and that is not going to happen. So the youth put their feet down. They said, we're not like furniture that we would be inherited by somebody. This attitude of pushing back against Republican monarchy was tied up with their conviction that these ruling families were corrupt, that they were stealing from the country, and that they were creating a system in which everybody else was disadvantaged and had no real future. One of the features of these revolutions by the youth is cross-class solidarity. In fact, I don't believe that they could have succeeded had they not been able to enlist allies from other social classes. The youth who made the revolution, according to what little investigation has been done, were disproportionately middle class and literate. However, they had a real sympathy and empathy for union workers, for blue-collar factory workers. And indeed, one of the major youth organizations, April 6 in Egypt, came into being because the youth supported a strike by textile workers in Al-Mahalla al-Kubra, an industrial town just north of Cairo. And these workers announced that they were going to strike on April 6th of 2008. And the youth put up a Facebook page for the workers, and they encouraged people to join in protests. And the government was very clear that these workers would not be allowed to strike, and they were not allowed to strike. The secret police, they wear this black clothing, and they have the shiny visors and very well armed. They came and made the workers work. No strike allowed. But the youth were able to smuggle out video of this repression, and then once the factory hours were over at 4 p.m., the workers did come in the middle of the town and staged a big demonstration in which they stomped on the pictures of the dictator Hosni Mubarak. And that might have been passed unnoticed because the regime controlled all the newspapers and the television. But the youth got smartphone video of these events and put them up on the web. And then the international satellite television stations like Al Jazeera took them from the web, from the blogs, and put them up for 20 million people to see on the television screen. So the way in which the youth worked together with the factory workers and their demands for better pay and better conditions, the way in which the youth intersected with old media, as well as in a very clever way using the new media, was all very important to their movement. Another example of new media activism was the issue of the murder of Khalid Said. It's a very murky story in some ways that some Egyptian scholars have tried to get to the bottom of. The outlines of the story are very clear, however. Khalid Said was a young man, educated, maybe a college dropout. He had spent some time in the United States. He was good at computers. He was young, and he still hadn't decided, I think, what to do with his life. But he was in an internet cafe in the northern port city of Alexandria. And the police came to the cafe owner and demanded that Khalid come out. And we don't know exactly why they were after him. Some people think that he had been part of a collective that was gathering evidence of police brutality. And that was one of the things the youth did was to get video of the police being brutal to people that they had arrested. The police maintained that he was known to smoke marijuana and they were checking him for drugs. This is almost certainly a cover story. But in any case, he came out into the alleyway and they beat him to death. And then they tried to cover it up, but they did have to call the family to identify the body in the morgue, and the brother took a picture of Khalid's smashed-in face, and that circulated on social media. In fact, people put it up as their Facebook page image, and so a Facebook page was made for Khalid Saeed. It attracted tens of thousands of friends and members, and the people who administered it were ideologically diverse. Some of them were from the Muslim right, some of them were from the secular left, and they were savvy about computers so that they were able to avoid the regime's cyber police. In Tunisia, a similar kind of a martyred hero of the youth emerged in the form of Mohamed Bouazizi, who was a vegetable peddler, and in Tunisia you have to have a license to peddle vegetables. And the stories there, you know, again, it's very difficult to document these things, but the story is that he was being bothered by the police in his hometown, a small town in southern Tunisia. Maybe they wanted a bribe, I don't know. He had just bought a couple $100 worth of vegetables, and they tore up his license. So then he had to go get a new license. He had to go to City Hall to see a bureaucrat, and it was a woman who was completely unsympathetic to him, and in fact, the family alleges that she slapped him and sent him away without his license. He was the sole breadwinner for his family, so he was full of despair at the way he was being treated, and he was essentially a small merchant, right, a peddler who wasn't able to function because of police corruption and indifference. So he went in front of City Hall and doused himself with gasoline and set himself on fire. He wasn't the first of the Tunisian youth to do this. There had been a rash of these self-immolations in Tunisia in the previous year and a half or so, mostly in provincial towns. But for one reason or another, his particular act of self-sacrifice caught the imagination of the Tunisian youth. It is incorrect to say that he was a college student. He probably was a high school dropout. You know, in countries in the Arab world influenced by France, they call a degree a baccalaureate, and I think maybe that was the source of the confusion about whether he was in college or not, but he wasn't. But they thought he was. If you go back, and there are still web pages from that era, the educated youth of Tunisia adopted him as a cause because they thought he was one of them, that he had been reduced to selling vegetables instead of pursuing a white-collar, high-powered degree because of the lack of jobs for educated youth in Tunisia, and then he had been mistreated in this way. Well, people started coming out and demonstrating about how Bouazizi had been treated and demanding justice for him. And these demonstrations grew, and then the secret police started firing on people and created more martyrs. And then the regime in Tunisia tried to hide this, and they denied that people had been wounded. So the youth bloggers went to the hospitals and used their smartphones to take pictures of the wounded and put them up on blogs and contradicted the regime's story. the crowds grew and grew and grew, and then they moved towards the capital, and finally you had 200,000 people in downtown Tunis demanding that the president step down. And at that point, it is said that Ben Ali asked his chief of staff, his army chief of staff, to please bring in the army and put these people down. And that General Ammar Rashid looked him in the eye and said, "Mr. President, I'm not going to shoot the Tunisian people for you." This was noble of him, but it probably also was imposed on him by his circumstances. Ben Ali was afraid of a coup. He had come to power as a general and had made a coup, and so he kept the army very small in Tunisia. And arguably, why would Tunisia need a big army? There were only about 30,000 men under arms. And if you have 200,000 people in the streets of Tunis, and that's just one city, maybe 30,000 troops are not enough to control the country's populace any longer. So I think General Rashid was principled, but I think he also had practical reasons for which he refused to deploy the army for policing purposes. Ben Ali did have a very large secret police of, it is estimated, 90,000, and they did fire on protesters, but in the end they were overwhelmed. And Ben Ali ultimately had to leave the country. So the youth were really good at moving out presidents for life. They were really good at removing the dictator. They deployed these techniques of demonstrations, and you know, there's a phenomenon in social media with Facebook and Twitter called, in English, the flash mob. And what they mean by that is that someone will announce, let's all get together at a particular place, say a mall, on Saturday at 4. And it has happened that people have done this frivolously, have done it for fun, and sometimes it's gone bad. So unexpectedly, 5,000 people would come to the mall, and the mall is not able to handle 5,000 people, and some people, there's a stampede, and some people get crushed. So it becomes a security concern, these flash mobs. Well, I would argue that the youth in these countries deliberately deployed the flash mob as a political tool. And they used it to paralyze the economy. They came and sat in downtown Cairo in Tahrir Square, which is a central square. Pretty much any place you wanted to go to in Cairo, you would have to go through it to get there. So if the young people are pitching tents and staying there and closing off traffic, nobody's making any money. And then they did this also in other cities, including port cities like Alexandria, Port Said. In fact, it seems to be that the Egyptian government lost control of all of its ports, that they just all became independent city-states. This is a security issue for a country like Egypt. So the youth deployed these methods very intensively. The Western reporting about these incidents tended to focus on the use of social media like Facebook and Twitter. This was a small phenomenon. I think only 1% of Egyptians were on Twitter at this time. Facebook was bigger. But a polling done in Tahrir Square suggested that only 25% of the demonstrators had heard about the demonstration through social media. Most of them, it was from face-to-face invitations from friends or phone calls or text messages. And a lot of the youth organizing was done on the ground. They would go door to door the way one might in a political campaign. And they would give pamphlets. They would see if people greeted them positively. And if they did, they kept a notation. So they had a huge database of neighborhoods which were positive towards them. And then when they demonstrated, they would march through the street and they would chant and they would say, we're all going to Tahrir Square, we'll be there at 4 p.m. So it became an advertisement for people to come down. And also they got people to shout these slogans from their balconies. Cairo is a very dense city, and if you shout something from your second floor balcony, everybody hears it. So they deployed not just social media, but these very traditional kinds of networking on the ground to get their message out. They, I think, were unrealistic in the sense that they felt as though, as youth, and many of them were 20, their job was to mobilize people and to put pressure on the president for life to step down. After that, they kind of wanted free and fair elections to go to a parliamentary system. They wanted something like what exists in Europe. But they didn't think of that second stage as their responsibility. They kind of turned it over to people my age. And of course, in many of these countries had laws that the youth wouldn't have been able to stand for parliamentary election. They weren't old enough. And they didn't form political parties, and they weren't thinking about the next stage of who would win the election. So both in Tunisia and Egypt, the right-wing religious parties came to power in the aftermath. And the secular-minded youth who had made these revolutions, that wasn't what they were going for at all. So in both cases, in Tunisia and Egypt, they mounted a second movement to put pressure on these right-wing religious parties to open up the system. In Egypt, the military took advantage of this and made a coup. In Egypt, it is controversial to call it a coup because there were like 15 million people on the streets, so it had a popular revolutionary aspect to it in 2013, protesting the Muslim Brotherhood government of Mohamed Morsi. So I call it a revolution. It had both elements of coup and revolution. But over time, the military just took back over, and they made it illegal to protest and jailed a lot of the youth who had been involved in 2011. In Tunisia, there was a happier story in that the right-wing religious party was relatively mature in its thinking, and when the youth started a new movement in 2013 in alliance with the National Workers Union, demanding that the new constitution be finished up, that it be a relatively secular document, so no Sharia or Islamic law is mentioned in the Tunisian constitution. Women and men are recognized as having equal rights in the constitution. These are all things that the base of the then ruling party, the Nahda or Renaissance Party, did not want. They wanted a religious government. But I think the party leaders felt that they just weren't strong enough to impose that on Tunisia, and they wanted social peace. So they finished up the constitution. The parliament voted on it in 2014 and approved it. And then they went to new elections, and the secular party won those. So Tunisia evolved towards something like a parliamentary government, and there's a place in that parliamentary government for more right-wing religious people and also for more left-wing people. And it's because of the continued activism of the youth that things evolved in this positive way. So what I would say is that they had great successes in some ways. They certainly changed the face of the region. They made it clear that these republican monarchies were not going to be allowed. But there was some magical thinking. They thought that if you could move out the president for life, that all of a sudden things would get better. I interviewed Tawakkol Kerman of Yemen, And I asked her lots of questions about Yemen's economic and political future. And her answer to every question was, well, if we get rid of Ali Abdullah Saleh, then everything will be fine. You know, that clearly is not true. And indeed, these revolutions themselves often caused an economic downturn. So there were successes, there were failures, but certainly there was revolutionary change, and it came from this new generation. Thank you.
Bueno, Nessrin El Hachlaf procede de otro cambio, de otro ámbito del conocimiento.
Comes from a different field of knowledge. She's a journalist. She has worked in different places, such as Radio Televisión Española, and she's mainly a lawyer. She has worked in different fields, particularly related to foreign affairs and foreign migrants, and she is particularly interested in the situation of the Arab woman. I think her experience is very rich and a first-hand experience, and in order for her to explain what's going on with the youngsters in the Arab countries, I think she's the perfect person. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I wanted to thank Casa Árabe for their invitation and the opportunity for me to be here, and in particular to Karim. It's an honor to be here with you and share this panel with Mr. Juan Cole. I wanted to provide a first definition of this millennial generation. We grew up with the Berlin Wall fall, with the death of Kurt Cobain, with the Kosovo War, with the Olympic Games of 1992. Our parents did not allow us to have a telephone until we were 16. We are addicted to Messenger, or we were actually the inventors of messengers, and we are addicted to mobile applications, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Wallapop. All these things is us. This is generation between 1982 and 2004. This is a generation that very often, for what we have been reading in the studies of the recent years, we are considered a lazy generation, narcissistic, very little cooperative. We are considered to be a yo-yo generation, to be between two worlds, between our parents' generation who fought for everything and us who wanted all to be given to us. However, we are very different things. We are not that sleeping generation or the broken dreams generation, as we have been called in many occasions. In Spain, we are above 8 million people born in the years of prosperity in a political, social, and economic and cultural environment that is totally different from the one that our parents lived, but who have had to face very dramatically the economic crisis gap that has cut sharply our dreams and our access to work, employment, and progress. We have been labeled as a generation as the no work, no studies generation, but we are actually floating above this reality. We are a generation that, compared to what our parents did, they wanted a job to survive and to live on, and we are looking for a job to live, that's right, but also to live better. We do not only want to eat, but we have the carpe diem as the motto that sustains our life. We want to enjoy life. All these aspects have given us the opportunity to be better educated. Actually, 53% of this generation has university studies compared to previous generations, and most of us, or many of us, have finished their careers, their degrees. This doesn't mean that we have an access to employment that corresponds to our education. Many of us with masters and PhDs or MBAs, we are overqualified for the types of jobs that we can have access to. We are bound to precarious jobs, to be apprentices all our lives and to earn very low living. We are trying to break the window ceiling, and we have been forced to leave our country, leave Spain, to look for a better life, sometimes to Germany, to London, and not exactly to working as lawyers or as engineers, but as waiters or cooks. What is a paradox is that we have been forced to do the jobs that many migrants were forced to do in Spain during the migration boom in the 90s. We are learning to place ourselves in the shoes of the others and to endure an economic and political crisis of a state. Spaniards have this gap, and although we have our own dreams and expectations, we have also found many issues when it comes to education and also in our access to employment. In this case, I'm not talking only about people who have their degrees and cannot access qualified jobs, but we cannot forget the people who had to drop their school and from the lower classes who decided not to study because we were living in the boom of the construction business, and currently it's this group of people, unqualified, and who represent above 38% of the Spanish population, who are the ones who are struggling the most to find a way to survive. They are finding themselves in unemployment, living in the scarcity and going back to live with their parents and sharing their room with their younger brothers and sisters. This is a small portion of the Spanish society that currently exists despite us. We are also the generation who have been labeled with different aspirations. We're not interested in having a mortgage. We do not care about having a luxury car or even having a car. We are resigned to blah cars and to Wallapop buying, but car and all these other low-cost options are not options for the future. This is not a generation that has broken stereotypes. We have been forced into using Airbnb and car because tourism is not within our reach. We are forced to share a car and to live the experience of renting a house because our economy is not enough to afford something else. We're not only millennials, but also we are earning even below the €1,000 a month. It's true that we're not very interested in cars or owning a car or a house. We're not interested in the material things, but it's also true that we are obsessed with the technology. We always have, and we want to have, and we have the latest generation mobile and the latest generation laptops, the smallest, the quickest, the flattest. This counteracts or is opposed to and it connected at the same time with our obsession with the social media, with publishing our life in Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, to publish our lives in every possible way with pictures and texts. This is the millennial generation, a narcissistic generation that wants to prove to itself that is living beyond their own possibilities. However, besides this, we are a generation who has lived the 15th of March with expectations for the future that were crushed and disappointed because in the political world we have realized that this is to no avail. The political system, Spanish democracy, has disappointed us. The emerging parties such as Podemos or Ciudadanos have also let us down. And it's true that in 2015 there were a greater percentage of youngsters who went to vote, but in the general elections in 2016, the people who, among the younger ones who didn't vote, reached 60%. This doesn't mean that we're lazy. We feel bored of politics. We are bored of the politicians. We're bored of the parties who don't give us anything. We're tired of corruption. We see that nothing is enough, that voting is not enough, which makes sense. Every day, every morning, we see on the media new corruption cases, not only related to politicians, but also regarding to the DAs. Not even DAs are free of corruption. In a poll among millennials, the conclusions were that they didn't have any hopes in politics, and that they just hoped for justice. As a lawyer myself, I am losing all hope in justice as well. When you see that the DA ministry is bought by the politicians, it really makes you lose all hope. So, to go back to the beginning, what's clear is that the youngsters are not lazy or unconcerned about politics, but that the way politics are done is tiring us. This is why we prefer to talk through tweets and breaking stereotypes. We do not receive information through the press. We do not buy the same newspapers or read the same information. Internet is a window to the world that has allowed us to get to know all sorts of perspectives and have our own ideas and to create also our own policy and our own way of doing politics. We're changing the world through tweets, through the tweets that we send every morning to turn a cause into a trending topic, a cause that may have not been known otherwise. But it's also true that behind a screen, we're not being able to prevent anything, as we're not stopping what's going on in Syria, and we're not making Spain host all the refugees that we should be holding, and we're not finishing with the inequality between men and women, with gender violence that kills thousands of women every year, and the children that they leave behind. All this is in our hands. We are the future generation. I don't think that our dreams are broken. I still dream, and I hope that you still do too. Thank you very much.